It's 6 o'clock in London. Finally, the times have synced. It's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Good morning, good afternoon, greetings, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID Livestream Series 10, Episode 6. That means we're at episode number 60 itself. Starts here. Let's have a few social mentions around the parish of exchanges to get us going. First of all, congratulations to Claudia Parzani. She's the new chairman of Borsa Italiana, putting a very, very delicate and elegant Salvatore Ferragamo stiletto through the glass ceiling, as Euronext chooses the lawyer who was previously deputy chairman to replace Andrea Cerrone, who's resigning in an attempt to become chairman of Generali, the Italian insurance multinational. Over at TP ICAP, plaudits to fund manager Justin Hughes, who has understandably been driven to write to those stewarding the TP ICAP share price aspiration, it seems to be penny stock, in a direction far from prosperity. And therefore, Justin has finally interjected and decided to try to move the shares forward. Interesting to see what asset sales we might get, or will he ultimately manage to find that private equity buyer that we've been talking about in Exchange Invest during the course of the last couple of months? All a storm in a TCAP or a TPI cap cup. Anyway, it was one of the 12 dirt cheap shares Investor Chronicle spotted at 231 pence. That was a long year ago, wasn't it? Meanwhile, from Exchange Invest, the London Metals Exchange, they're starting to fight back on the nickel front. They're going to be doubling almost the size of their default fund as the metals prices remain incredibly volatile thanks to the Ukrainian situation. And indeed, of course, that major Chinese position that we've seen in recent weeks. Meanwhile, red faces all round down under in Australian Stock Exchange, as their $30 million, now $250 million chest replacement is going to be delayed once again. It's the fourth delay. What could possibly be the saving of this, ladies and gentlemen? Could it be, of course, that it's a WD GAN formation for those of you who are technical analysis nerds, and then we're going to see breakthrough and finally implementation? Or, as seemed to be the talk of the Boca Raton cigar salons the other week, perhaps it's going to be a case that now there's going to be a new CEO. The first thing he's going to be doing is binning the digital asset system, which is, of course, already multiple years late in its implementation cycle. Happy belated birthday to Charles Lee, the former Hong Kong Exchange's CEO, and the man who delivered the Hong Kong Exchange's gateway to China. Peter Osborne, he's departed TMX in London for the exciting new pastures of Apple DeFi, a corporate investor in the burgeoning DeFi space, which has just completed a pre-IPO funding round. All the very best, Pete, on this exciting new endeavor. And finally, a few electoral successes to report. Mark Wheatley, one of our regular viewers, congratulations. Delighted to see that Mark and his running mate were returned to the ward of Dowgate in the city of London this week. And indeed also congratulations to my old colleague from Life Days, Henrika Priest, in the Castle Baynard ward. It was always a joy to work with you when I was consulting to Life all those years ago, Henrika, and I'm delighted to see you've been re-elected to the Corporation of London. All this and more has been covered in greater detail in Exchange Invest Daily, the unique newsletter of the Bourse Business. Send us an email or hit me up, Patrick L. Young, on whatever social media stream you're watching this now, and we can get you signed up to understand the exchange business with a free 30-day trial. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is the fantastic Catherine McBride. The topic, after Brexit, where next for world trade? Catherine is a senior economist. She's been writing, researching on international trade, agricultural trade and innovation, financial services regulation, corporate governance, competition and public policy for many years. She sits on the UK Trade and Agricultural Commission as a member of that grouping, and she's a former staffer of the London IEA, that used to be called the Institute of Economic Affairs, think tank. Well, what a fantastic and exciting moment it is to welcome our guest today. First of all, let me just say hello to a few people. Thank you very much, Marcus Ward. Great to see you joining the show today. Hello, Peter. Good to see you once again. And indeed, I do believe we've got a triumvirate of good folks from the UK coming in there. Hello, Craig. It's a delight to see you as well joining the show. So, without further ado, our guest, Catherine McBride. Catherine, let me hope that the producers are going to add you to the screen and I can ask you our opening question. Where in the world are you today?
I'm back in London, which is where I'll be for the next few months, at any rate, having spent the January in Australia, in Sydney, and most recently in South Africa. So I'm back here now.
Fantastic. That must have been rather intrepid. How was Australia during January? How did you even get into Australia during January?
Well, I've got the very important Australian passport, obviously. No, they opened it all up. Everyone was back and forward from, I think it was end of November that was all open. So, there are Australians going home, taking new babies back, and Australians coming to see their children who'd moved to London years ago. It was all happening. Same in South Africa. In fact, I shared a plane down there with virtually half the plane seemed to be people carrying babies and strollers and stuff like that. So I assume they're all taking them back to show them to grandparents.
I suppose that must be now an acute point of international supply chain shortage. All those huge Chinese carriers full of stuff from AliExpress were all going around, Cape Horn and thinking, okay, good, we're going towards Europe. Darn, they're all going to see the rallies in South Africa or Australia. Head south as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Quite fascinating, the dislocation that's been going on during the course of this time. So we got to know each other because we had a mutual interest in a little thing called Brexit, which, like COVID-19, some people may have heard about because it got a bit of news time over the course of the last few years, even before COVID-19 was the thing. Tell me, how did you come to be involved in the original kind of Brexit movement?
Well, I have been working in the City of London since 1987. And this was during the, in the early 90s when we were part of the European exchange rate mechanism. And then we dropped out of the exchange rate mechanism. It was a time when people were talking about the pound joining the euro. And as I traded the European markets at this time, I could see that Europe was going to be very difficult even for in those days, 12 countries that were in Europe to form a single currency. But for the pound to join in, our whole economy was out of synchronization with most of Europe because we were much more geared towards international trade, even then, than we continued to be. So we were doing much more trade. Our biggest trading partner was the United States at that time. And so we were sort of a halfway thing where the US would go up, then the UK would go up, and then eventually Germany would go up. So we were just all out of whack. And for us to align our currency with them was just silly. And I, along with a lot of people in the city, including some of our mutual friends, joined a sort of Save the Pound group, which eventually continued when we got an opportunity to get out of the EU, which quite frankly, I never thought we'd get. So when Cameron did give us a referendum, I definitely jumped onto that group because I thought it was very important that the UK get out of the EU, because much as I love Europe and I have not only traded all their markets, I've lived in Italy, I've lived in Germany, I've lived in France, I speak their languages, I understand their customs and their nuances. I could also see that Britain is different. Britain is much more international in its outlook. And it was just always the odd man out of Europe. I mean, a lot of people say, why did we leave? But if you looked at it, we never really joined. We dropped out of the ERM, then we dropped out. We never joined the Euro. We never joined Schengen. We sort of always had one foot out of the door, which some people thought was an advantage. But I think in the long run, it was a disadvantage. If we wanted to influence policy in Europe and actually do things, I think the Europeans always regarded us a little bit of not committed, if you like. So they were less inclined to listen to us, but also they had different ways of doing things.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting because I think two great guests we've had on in the past. We Daniel Hodson, who obviously was one of those people you were alluding to, dating all the way back to the Save the Pound mechanism and so on. And I remember also actually subsequently the next chairman of Life, also Sir Brian Williamson, was very keenly involved with that group too. He's not been on this show yet, but if you're watching, Sir Brian, we'd love to see you. And also we had more recently, Barney Reynolds was talking all about the legal aspects of Brexit. I mean, you haven't touched on those, but I think it's quite fascinating. I mean, I'm sitting here today, as you may have guessed, dear viewer, somewhere in the Caribbean, and we have a very elegant system of Anglo-Saxon common law sitting around us, which is entirely different to the Roman law, which prevails in weird, wacky, and wonderful places, such as large swathes of the European Union.
Oh, it's not just law. It's also our attitude to finance, which was very important in the city. When I was trading the European markets, I found that they were very suspicious of the whole concept of selling shares in a company. A German once said to me, "Why would I sell shares in my company if it's making money? You'd only do that if it's losing money." And that was pretty much the mentality you met time and time again. Obviously, the legal system is very different, as Barney has definitely told you about, but I discussed that with Barney years ago when we were writing a common document. The common law is what we have in Australia. Pretty much all former colonies have common law. America uses common law. It suits our financial system as well as our attitude to finance. We also have different politics. The UK is the only place in Europe with a first past the post political system. So almost every European country has a kind of a shared political system where they have to do coalitions, which means no one ever gets really what they voted for because whatever party they voted for has to do some deal with someone else. And or you have the French system where the president seems to have a lot more power than any equivalent person in the UK. So it's really quite different. And I think a lot of people didn't understand that when they joined, or they didn't think about it clearly enough as to how that these two things would never get really meshed together well.
No, indeed, it's been quite a remarkable run altogether. And let me just diverge for a second and say, well, hello, Simon Huckle, hello, Marcus Ward, hello, Peter Secon, hello, Craig Richardson. Great to see you all watching today. Thank you very much. If you've got a question for our guest today, Catherine McBride, we're going to be talking about the wonderful world of world trade, and indeed after Brexit, we're next for world trade. We're going through the Brexit bit at the moment, ladies and gentlemen. Send us a little love on Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn, wherever you're watching this today. We'd really appreciate it. Helps get us up through those AI search algorithms operated by people who are not necessarily Brexit or world trade friendly, it might feel some days, but maybe that's just a conspiracy theory in a world of conspiracy theories. Who knows? Anyway, Catherine, I mean, coming back to this whole, the whole Brexit topic, you mentioned a lot about the whole issue about trade, dynamics, investment. And I agree with you. I mean, the UK is very, very different in the way that it approaches the means of doing business, and certainly the growth orientation, which is not something that I think the European Union 27 really understand. The precautionary principle, which is probably one of the most horrible impoverishment engines that we have ever seen that sits at the heart of the European Union, is a huge problem. So how did you get, as a matter of interest, taking a step to one side, into the IEA? What got you there from the business of trading in the City of London?
Well, I had retired, if you like, to look after children, as a lot of women do these days. And then after the Brexit referendum, Daniel Hodson, who you mentioned earlier, was setting up a group called the Financial Service Negotiation Forum, Financial Services Negotiation Forum, hard to say. And that was getting groups of people around any topic in the city. So we're getting practitioners, bankers, small and medium-sized enterprises, lawyers, people who knew about the particular topic. And everyone was discussing, if the regulations could now change, what changes would we like to see? And we went through pretty much every topic. And this was within the first year of leaving or of voting for the referendum. And that group was eventually backed into another think tank called the Legatum Institute, and into their trade and competition group, which was run by Shankar Singham. And then as a whole group, we then moved to the IEA. So there was a sort of a couple of reverse takeovers. And that was quite a good merger of different skills. But, Daniel was very quick to see right from the get-go that we needed to really start looking at the regulation, because everyone in the City of London was complaining about EU regulation. But when you said to them, well, what do you want to change? It was hard to get people to agree on that. We were also very quick, I must say, to realise how important liquidity would be to keep the UK as the world's dominant market. And I think that has worked out quite well. And it took a lot of other groups a long time to catch up with that. We still see a lot of people predicting that everyone will leave the UK. There was yet another article in the Times today, the London Times, about this, when even though the original predictions were 70,000 or 700,000, it's turned out to be about 7,000. And yet just implementing the MiFID II regulations employed about 11,000 people in the City of London. So, and apparently those 7,000 jobs may have left. I think about 5,000 have come to London, because a lot of European banks have had to set up some sort of office in London as well, or have decided to set up. They probably didn't have to, but they have done so. So it's a lot of people who were calling that it would all be doom and gloom if we left have had to technically eat humble pie, but we find they've got very good marketing, and they keep pushing out these PR stories into newspapers who should know better, who should be going, oh, hang on a minute, that's not what last time you were talking about this 3 years ago and it didn't happen. So why would we listen to you now? But
yeah, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Because when you look at what was being predicted on June the 23rd, 24th, 2016, I mean, essentially it was going to be just a barren oasis, something like the area around Chernobyl, which would just be gently smouldering with a few people left as refugees in mud huts. And it would be the end of the City of London. It was absolutely, it was beyond obscene. And I remember doing a TV interview at the time, and actually the best fun about it was that amongst 4,000 hate-ridden pieces of invective in the comments, one piece stood out, which my wife read to me, which was, how dare he spread optimism? And it was incredible, and it remains incredible, because here you are, spreading sunny Reaganite optimism. And you're right. I mean, most of the changes in the City of London always involve a frictional move, about 7,000 to 10,000 jobs. That's just the nature of the beast. I mean, Japanese warrant trading disappearing in 1980, 1989, 91. Same sort of numbers. Nothing has changed. We actually got a couple of fascinating questions that have just come in. I'm going to take them in reverse order, production team, just to confuse you. Let's go to Jeff Cutler first of all. I'm going to come to Peter Second in a second. So Jeff Cutler is asking a very interesting question. Good evening, by the way, Jeff, or good afternoon, Jeff, because you're in Eastern time as well in New York. Hello, Patrick. What do you and Catherine, I'm going to let Catherine have first dibs on this as she's our illustrious guest, think about what the ZM Financial Centre Index says about London, still number 2, but has lost a few points in the latest, which was just like last week, if I remember correctly, the latest ZM Global Financial Centres Index. Catherine.
I've been watching this index for a while, and I know the people who put it together, and I think it's a great thing. And I will say that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, London was number 1. And I think it's important, and I really wish the people at the Corporation of the City of London or the Bank of England would pay this a bit more attention. Because while being number 2 is not a bad thing, but they've got to look at that, because the trend has been down, albeit by 1 point, a year. It has been going down by about 1 point a year. And we have the ability to really change that. And yet the Bank of England hasn't really changed any of the regulations yet. I've written papers about it. The Financial Negotiating Centre wrote papers about it. The Barney Reynolds has written papers about this. The Tigger report, Ian Duncan Smith put together a very massive paper about regulations that could change. And so far, no regulations have changed. And that is a massive missed opportunity. Now, I know we've had COVID, and I know we've got the Ukraine war and things like that are getting in the way and probably taking up a lot of the bandwidth in Westminster. But this is something that the City of London cannot ignore. It's really got to look at where it's losing those points and how they could change that. Because for the most part, they could change it, but they just don't seem to be doing anything.
It's quite incredible. Sorry to interrupt, but it's quite incredible, isn't it? Because you look at the Bank of England, and in our careers, we both started in the City of London in 1987.
Yeah.
You think about the number of conferences we went to in the 80s and 90s, and the Bank of England could wheel out somebody who seemed to have done research on absolutely everything there was going. And I mean, the Bank of England had produced voluminous amount of thinking about whether or not the pound should go into the euro or not. And that wasn't even being suggested as a really serious thing, apart from a fortnight over Tony Blair or something like that. But then everything was a serious thing to Tony Blair for a fortnight, including Formica tabletops throughout the House of Lords or something. But it's quite incredible. They've had 6 years and done nothing, which does make one certainly feel a little bit paranoid that perhaps the Bank of England don't really have a lot of interest in doing Brexit. I don't know. I mean, I think it's scandalous, personally.
Well, I think also there's been a change in the city where there's more and more very big world banks there, and that's good because they employ a lot of people. But a lot of the innovation in the City of London always started with smaller firms, sometimes breakaway firms, people who were the head trader at some big bank, moves away and starts his own hedge fund or something like that. And that is slowing down. It's becoming, there's more regulation. It's making it harder for people to leave and start new businesses, start their own business, do something a bit different. And that's a pity because that is the dynamism of the City of London comes from that ability for small firms to think of new ideas. We are seeing it in the fintech sector, and the fintech sector has been fantastic. But a lot of it hasn't really grown to sort of world-class or even national sort of size, which when you compare
the fintech thing, the fintech thing is a very interesting comparison. But you see, I would also say it took the fintech thing 15 years to get going. I mean, there was some bloke, perhaps not unadjacent to this conversation, wrote a best-selling book about it in 1999, and we didn't even get the word fintech for another 10 years. So, I mean, the City of London does seem to have had a problem being slow. I would also actually have to say I pin a lot of the blame on lack of innovation back on the European Union, because it used to be that the City of London allowed all manner of very simple, flexible structures like partnerships and things like that in order to manage to be capital-bearing entities, and suddenly everything had to become a highly regulated enterprise, which made it much more difficult to get into. And also, actually, amusingly, even though I'm the ultimate acolyte of electronic markets, it was probably easier to be an independent in the 1980s or 90s because you could do things from the floors of exchanges without having to have a huge amount of infrastructure. And technologically, it's actually ended up being more difficult to do that as we go along.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that is to do with the fact that it's not so much the European Union as an entity, but the fact that it's very easy for very large corporations to control the European Union and its thinking and provide it with well-documented research that might have once been done by the Bank of England. And they obviously, as a group, prefer lots of regulation. It makes it easy to sell their products because people believe that someone is watching them. So the regulators are looking after my money so I can give it to these people. But it also means it's a massive barrier to entry to new people coming into the market. So it really protects their position. So it's a sort of double whammy. And the more we get big banks, and if you look at the number of banks that have disappeared or been absorbed, not really disappeared, but been merged with other banks since you and I came to the city. You know, I found one of my old client call sheets, I was clearing out a drawer, and virtually all of the names on it didn't exist as an entity. I mean, even when I put my CV together, almost every bank I worked for, I have to put in brackets who that is now, because a young person looking at my CV wouldn't recognize any of the names that are on it. All of them have been absorbed into major banks, and it's...
Well, I have a hilarious issue with that, because I had a regulator recently who were trying to investigate something, and it was hilarious because they were looking for my original employer, and my original employer was a division of Tullet in Tokyo, and they were looking for it in TP ICAP, and TP ICAP were saying, never heard of him, which was absolutely fair, because it was oved off many, many years before what became Tullet Preborn became TP ICAP. Yeah. And the confusion of those multi-layers of thing. One thing I certainly think, to go back to the Jeff Cutler question, which worries me, and you may have the numbers at your fingertips much better than I, walking around the City of London when we would have started in the late 1980s, I mean, it was a cornucopia, a gazetteer of the world. You could find all of these exotic banks from weird and wonderful places that came along. Now, if you look at it today, in those days, the Banker magazine did a top 500 banks in the world. Nowadays, they do a top 1,000 banks in the world. The 1,000th bank is way, way, way bigger, even allowing for inflation, and not just QE inflation, than the 500th was 30, 40 years ago. But yet, it strikes me that the City of London still lacks a coherent focus on actually going out and marketing to those banks in the world and saying, this is why you should be in London. I mean, it's so laissez-faire. If you look at foreign direct investment the world over, and we'll get on to world trade in a second, I mean, there are hundreds of people go out and literally grab you by the scruff of the neck and try to drag you to Ireland or drag you to the Caribbean or some part of Canada and invite you to be an investor if you're going to try and build cars or widgets or something like that. Yet in the financial centres respect, it strikes me that the City of London is incredibly overly laissez-faire about not trying to make sure that they fill in the holes in the banks where they don't get so many regional entities, etc., where traditionally the City of London did have those sorts of banks many years ago.
Well, there's two parts to that. It's not all the problem with the City of London. A lot of this is to do with international banking regulations, and we see it at both ends, not just banks not in London, but also a lot of the correspondent banks that used to operate in the Caribbean or in Africa, and we're a big part of enabling them to do trade. Have all of the British banks have closed those branches, their correspondent bank branches, because it makes it more difficult for them to tick all the boxes that are required from the Basel Group or required by the International Monetary Fund or required by the financial stability regulations. And unfortunately, pulling back out of those markets, a lot of Chinese banks have gone in and said, well, we don't care about that. We'll go and offer these people financial services. So we're potentially losing markets because of our regulation, if you like. And at the other extreme about marketing, it's not just marketing the product, it's making the product easy to use when you get here. I mean, this is an anecdotal story, but I think I've checked up on it and it seems to be true generally. One of the big Brexiteers that I knew was setting up a new fund, a new investment fund, and he set it up in Luxembourg. And I said, what on earth did you do that for? And he said, well, when you turn up, they just give you the papers and say, sign here, here, and here. And he says, it takes you about 5 minutes. And in London, It will take years. And you think, well, that's an area we maybe have to look at. Why is it that Dublin and Luxembourg have these things down pat and make it very easy for investors to go there? And London is making it very difficult. And no one has even thought about how they can encourage funds who do run their management companies in Dublin, even when the fund manager or the person making the investment decisions is sitting in London, the actual nuts and bolts of the fund, day-to-day stuff is sitting in Dublin still or sitting in Luxembourg. That seems an area that the Bank of England should be looking at and trying to encourage that business to come back to London, because that business employs a lot of people. it's not as sexy as being the guy that makes the big decisions and buys and sells and holds, but it employs a lot of people. And
well, the irony is, I mean, isn't the irony of all this sort of thing, you're talking about Luxembourg and Dublin and so on, the irony is that there's actually an agreement between the Irish government and Northern Ireland, which remains part of the UK, albeit run through the Brussels-Congo mechanism of the European Union's land grab, thanks to the moron Theresa May, who was briefly prime minister but never actually in government, I think it's fair to say. The point about that is that, I mean, there are so many areas of the UK that have traditionally prospered from having those back office organizations. And where is it? I mean, JP Morgan inhabit, I think, about a third of Bournemouth. And certainly used to be back in the day, if people remember, Chemical Bank, they were all in North Wales. And you've got huge offices of people like various of the custodian banks that are around the UK. And those are the jobs that could come back if the process was better organized. And let me offer a hearty thank you to HSBC, who cancelled my credit card last year because I didn't go to the UK to collect it during lockdown. The fact that the rest of the world could work out there was COVID on and the British bank couldn't rather tells you everything I think about what we're talking about here. To go back to Jeff Cutler's question. So many things need to be improved in the City of London, but it's still a powerhouse and it's far from being an oasis. Let's move the conversation on a little bit, if we may, Catherine. We got a great question, actually, to open that up as we go towards more of a world trading angle. Peter Secon, thank you so much for being patient. Hope the baby's well. Good luck to Ari. Hope he's sitting beside you on the couch, having a great day, watching his dad asking intellectual questions as always. So Peter asked the question, which our production team have lost. Good evening, Catherine. How do we fix the UK-European trade balance that exists? Well, that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a big question. For many, many years, we had a big imbalance of trade with the in goods trades, not service trade. So from now on, when I talk trade, I'm going to be talking goods. So basically, we bought their goods. They made stuff. We bought it from them. And then sometimes quite a lot of that stuff they didn't buy. They imported from China and we bought it from them. So there's been an interesting change in the statistics. I'm not exactly sure what Peter's referring to, because our general trade balance with Europe will change over time. Now that we are getting trade deals signed with other countries, we'll be able to buy things directly from those countries. And you are also seeing that goods that once came into the European Union and then were transferred to the UK in what they used to call the Rotterdam effect, that is now being registered. If the goods are not changed when they come in, they now have to be registered as coming from the country they were made in. So we're seeing what was always there, but we called it the Rotterdam effect because we couldn't tell that the bicycle parts that were being sent from the German company were actually made in China, because from our point of view, they looked like an import from Germany. Well, now they're coming in as an import from China. So you will find in most trade statistics, it does look like we're buying more from the rest of the world and we're buying less from Europe. But I think you'll find, if we could go into it more granularly, that a lot of this stuff we were always buying from the rest of the world. It was just being landed in a port in Europe and then shipped to us. So that is now becoming apparent in the statistics. There are other things that we've seen some trade where people are turning more to UK manufacturing, which is great, but it's not being recorded well and being ignored by the mainstream media. So there's been some recent reports in the UK, and unfortunately, even something by our own Treasurer, Chancellor of the Exchequer, that they seem to be worried about a drop in imports from Europe, when in fact, some of it is just now imports from the real country it's coming from, which was never Europe, or B, people are actually buying more UK goods. And for some reason, the Treasurer's not clocking that, or people aren't thinking about that as to, that might be a good thing, making our own stuff again. I think a lot of the UK public are interested in buying something from the UK if they get that choice. Often they don't get that choice. There are a lot of people who cease to find supply chains within the UK and have just always gone overseas. But I was talking to someone about this today, and it does appear that there is more goods being manufactured here that are being ignored, and people are concentrating on the trade figures without going, well, what about the actual domestic production figures? How are they changing? So, and then there's other things in the trade figures at the moment where for a long time during COVID, things like there was a shortage of computer chips that go into cars, so that the volume of cars we were buying from Germany was way down because of a shortage of chips. And people sort of panicked looking at the gross figures without looking at them more granularly and seeing where the shortages were. Because Germany is such a big part of the trade we did with Europe. I know we like to call it Europe, but if you look at what we're actually buying from the EU in total, a large chunk of it was coming from Germany. I think it was something like 1 in every 4 pounds we spent in the EU was coming from Germany. So it's, a quarter of all the trade. So, and a hell of a lot of that was cars. So if you can't buy cars because the cars don't have the chips, then you see a massive drop in the trade, which, is not actually Brexit related, though it's getting blamed on Brexit. It's more to do with COVID and supply chain problems. So I don't know if that answered Peter's question, but it is, as you say, a big question. And we could talk about the trade balance that's existed for the last 40 years, which has basically been gradually over time. The UK stopped making things and started importing it from the EU. But then the EU stopped making stuff and started importing it from Asia and then branding it in the EU and then selling it to us. So now we're going to see, unless they do at least 2 changes, it'll have to be put down as a Chinese import rather than a German import.
Well, that's quite fascinating altogether, and obviously that has a big impact on sort of the AliExpress economy, et cetera, the Alibaba economy, and how things can come to us so much more easily, more directly from China, providing, of course, that your tanker driver doesn't actually manage to make a container ship handbrake turn in the middle of the Suez Canal and manage to stuff everything up for a few weeks. But nonetheless, I mean, if we look at the whole dynamics, thank you very much, Peter Secon, for your question. Feel free to add a supplement. I'm here discussing after Brexit, where next for world trade, with a super policy expert in the field, Catherine McGuinness. Catherine, if I may just ask you, I mean, current world trade dynamics, you've alluded to a couple of things, and it is obviously quite fascinating because since even we spoke, good grief, there's a war's broken out in the Ukraine when we did the prep call. And here we are, we've got war in the Ukraine, we've got all sorts of supply chain issues, as you've alluded to, for example, computer chips and so on. China's going back into lockdown, etc. It's an incredibly interesting and challenging time for world trade, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But it's also, if people would seize the opportunity, I mean, they used to say in the city, out of every disaster, there's an opportunity. And for anyone who was having trouble competing with China before, this is their opportunity to compete. And I'm not just talking about people in the UK. There are a lot of developing Asian markets and developing African markets that could definitely start filling those orders that maybe can't come out of various Chinese provinces. And that will be fantastic for their economies as well. It would obviously help us because we continue to be able to be buying cheap goods, but it would help them as well. So I think that it's got to be looked at as an opportunity. I'd also love there'll be quite a few things that could probably be manufactured in the UK or bought back on shore as well if people were able to do that. But, we've got to become a bit more versatile in our supply chains, because also I think this became apparent in the first month of COVID or two, is people began to realize how much we depended on the single market, China. And you really, if you were running a small business, you would probably want to have multiple suppliers, or at least backup suppliers, where if one guy let you down, you knew who you could turn to. But internationally, whole countries were dependent on China to supply 80% of the ingredients for pharmaceuticals. So we might make the actual finished drug, but the ingredients are coming from China. So suddenly we couldn't make the finished drug. So, we had all the boxes ready and we had the little pill cases ready, but we didn't have the ingredients. So there was a lot of areas where I think people began to look at it and go, wow, that's crazy. We've got to have alternative suppliers.
So that brings us a brilliant opportunity for Britain. And I must say, I would also look at a very mundane level, which was, it shocked me how many British jams, marmalades and condiments all seem to end up being made in Eastern Europe, which didn't have quite the same tradition of having an English afternoon tea, which I thought was quite scandalous during the course of the European Union's toehold in the UK economy. We got a supplement actually from Peter Second, quite interesting. It's taking us slightly away, but he's interested in the whole wonk world, which you were obviously part of after your period of intense mothering, and then equally the period when you were a trader before that. So during your time at the IEA in London, what do you feel, Catherine, was your biggest achievement in regards to solving an economic or social problem that you were involved in directly or indirectly?
Well, I wrote 3 papers all about, I wrote a lot of small articles and small papers, but I wrote 3 big papers all about financial regulation and how that could be changed. And though, as I said in the beginning, none of these regulations have been changed yet, all of these ideas have been picked up and written about by the Bank of England and in the Tigger report. The Tigger report even cites one of the IEA papers where I wrote all of the financial section. I didn't write the whole paper, but I wrote the financial pieces. So I planted a seed in someone's mind about what could change, which is good. And I got those seeds from talking to a lot of people in the city and listening to everyone and trying to put it together in a way that would work. But nothing has changed yet. So, you can plant a seed, which is basically what think tanks do. But it's the actual way our government works is incredibly slowly. And it's not really geared up to deal with the sort of crisis of COVID and the crisis of the Ukraine. So that it distracts people really easily. I'm presently on the Trade and Agricultural Committee. And from someone out of an environment where your word is your bond and you pick up the phone and if you say, buy me 100 at 6 or whatever, you just bought 100 at 6, that's it, and that's how quick it happens. And suddenly in government, most people will remember that the Australian trade deal signed the terms of trade, and you could find it on the internet from, I think, June last year. Then it took another 6 months for them to actually sign the legals agreement. Then the commission that I'm part of is now scrutinizing every inch of that, not just mine, but there are lots of commissions doing little sections of the paper. And then it will be scrutinized by Parliament. And then it will go through primary legislation and then secondary legislation. And it'll, if we are able to trade freely with Australia by June next year, that'll be a result. And
yes,
I'm the only person on this commission who didn't come out of this sort of legal bureaucratic environment. And I'm sort of tearing my hair out going, you've got to be kidding me. Like this, like a year away. But they're all fine. They look at you like, didn't you know this? This is how it works. You think, oh, God.
Well, I also think I've got to stop you there. I think that's the great phrase of government. Didn't you know this is how it works? Yeah. Well, it doesn't work if it takes 6 years to manage to negotiate something or do something. The thing I also find hilarious is by the time we actually get the agreement, they'll probably be on a completely different Australian government. Nobody will remember Scotty from marketing sitting in the back garden of Number 10 holding up his packet of Tim Tams as he did with a cheesy grin for his domestic audience to show how great it would be for Australian exports. And it is incredible just how slow the government is. And in fact, talking about being incredibly slow for government, Catherine, messy times. Christopher Messina points out the original error, in his opinion, was Bill Clinton letting China into the World Trade Organization before there was significant change demanded of their horrendous internal affairs, which was also a bit like the European Union allowing Bulgaria and Romania as still feudal states into the European Union, just because they thought that would be a counterweight to Britain, which didn't work either. Now, Catherine, we're into the sort of final 10 minutes here. We're talking about after Brexit, where next for world trade. And I'm aware of the fact that we've barely managed to hit more than, oh, good grief, about 25 jurisdictions out of, say, 190 something that are represented at the UN. When you look at the dynamics of UK trade deals, okay, soporifically slow is part of the negotiating beast. And certainly it doesn't help, it has to be said, in my opinion, that we've barely had a fortnight of outbreak of UK government in the course of the last about 12 years. But at least it did get us a Brexit agreement through, which I suppose is something good. But if you look at these UK trade agreements, which will eventually be signed off and will actually be operating, and therefore they will empower entrepreneurs to import and hopefully also drive more produce and more goods throughout the world, how does that feed into world trade?
In what way? I mean, that is what trade's all about. Trade is about buying things that from another country who can produce them more efficiently or more cheaply than you can. And that is, a lot of people see trade as exports, and they want to sell things, which does work for, say, some very small countries. Switzerland and Sweden are sort of world class at this, have managed to produce a single, not a single, a couple of world class products that are all over the world now, because they didn't have a big enough economy or a big enough population to just work on their own population. So they went for trade. The UK is in the opposite position, where we have a big enough population and have had a tradition through the whole empire days of importing things and finding exotic products that we never even could possibly produce in our own country and importing them. And that has benefited consumers here. They have a much wider variety of things to choose from, and are more open-minded, I think, to the rest of the world because of that. So, I lived in Italy years ago, and I was really surprised that I couldn't find a Chinese restaurant. And when I asked an Italian where there was a Chinese restaurant, he looked at me like, why would you want a Chinese restaurant? We have Italian restaurants. That's the best food in the world. Just eat Italian.
Absolutely.
And that
isn't that also the other corollary to that is trying to point out to the Italians that it was the Chinese who invented pasta, which is usually enough to send them into a giddy downturn. I mean, at that point.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
No, don't go there. And actually, but that's a very interesting point you're making about the cosmopolitanism of the UK, and in fact the way that, yes, I mean, the British eat all manner of cuisine from around the world, and certainly as a result of, they took the spice trade incredibly seriously in the UK that they didn't perhaps in other parts of the world. Now, I've got a great question here actually from Chris Messina again, which is sort of building on from my own very bland missive a moment ago. At this stage in history, Catherine, what would you suggest as the most efficient and least painful transition back to encouraging more domestic production in the likes of the UK, the US, Italia?
Well, actually, there's a huge amount that was transferred out of the UK to benefit from lower wages internationally that now with mechanization could probably come back to the UK, because you probably find that robots, it might not be what people want to hear. They want to think of massive 600,000 people employed in a big factory somewhere in Birmingham, but those days are probably over. Even in China, they're not doing that. But you will find a lot of manufacturing will come back to the UK if you're using robots to make it. And the UK has that intellectual innovation, to do that, to build those robots. I'm sure there are kids in universities in Cambridge and Birmingham and Manchester who are inventing this stuff as we speak. And so there is a lot of that will come back, but you'll also find new industries will start here and maybe stay here because they won't, if they're not highly labor intensive production, they don't need to go to other places. I mean, even what you're doing now, Patrick, by running this sort of interview thing, 30 years ago, you would have needed a studio set up, you would have needed a cameraman, you would have needed lighting, sound engineers.
Absolutely.
I do a lot of interviews, both on the BBC and GB News. I'm sort of, I've got a foot on both sides. And it's incredible because GB News is a brand new studio and the whole thing is run by computers. So there's no cameraman in the room where you're being interviewed. When you go to the BBC, there's at least 2 or 3, and there's all these cords and wires, and they're keeping saying, "Oh, don't trip on the wire, and watch out for the wire." They're all along the floor. You don't see that; they cut that out of the production. But it's all, and so it's that sort of ancient history, and the GB News channel is how it is, and then you are the future because it won't be long before no one will have a studio, and it'll all just be done as you're doing it. And sitting in the tropics, which is like, duh. Why isn't everyone sitting?
Absolutely, but it's very interesting because that whole process of being able to give people the right to produce their own content, and I mean 25 30 years ago, pretty much 30 years ago, actually 28 years ago, I was already traveling the world as a digital nomad, but at that stage you had a suitcase full of stuff just to connect your very large bulky laptop to the internet, whereas nowadays digital nomadry is all about packing a t-shirt, your flip-flops and a pair of shorts and essentially turning up in some far-flung place and going, where's the Wi-Fi? And that's true. I mean, the whole technology is quite incredible. Yes, I had a shocking experience the other year because we were trying to talk about the then possible revelation that Malta was going to become a digital blockchain island. We turn up at the TV studio and they've got a TV studio that has like 8 people working in it, including 2 people working cameras. And you're sitting thinking, there are only 500,000 people in the whole island. I mean, comparative advantage surely is you automate everything you possibly can. It's quite intriguing altogether. And therefore, I suppose, we're looking at something that's really a revolution. And I suppose that really does bring me to that question that I always like to ask during the course of these programs. Where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Oh, the capital market. I was going to add to that that is the industry that is so often overlooked because it's not a sort of financial service and it's not a sort of car production. But the UK is incredibly good and always has been at the production of media. Books, films, TV, they sell it all around the world. Obviously, it's helped by the English language. And now we've got so many of the podcasts going out all over the world as well. Sorry, what your question was, where does the financial services go next?
It can be anything. Where does any part of the digital revolution go next? I wrote the book Capital Market Revolution, so I'm always obsessed with capital markets and fintech and things like that. But where does the revolution go next in any possible way, sense, shape or form in terms of world trade, you name it?
Well, I think that online sales is the future. That one of the things that has been a bit of a bugbear for people who are worried about the trade deal with Australia. We have had animal rights groups complaining about distances in Australia that animals have to travel to market. Now, weirdly, we have discovered that they travel shorter distances there than they maybe do in the UK because Australia has better placed abattoirs around the country. But they've also changing the sales, the way sheep are sold, so you can sell them online. So rather than having to transport them to an animal market, you can suddenly sell things online so that they can stay in the paddock where they're nice and comfortable and you can film them and people can buy them and they're a mob and it's all digitalized. You're also seeing that in keeping track of animals. So all of the animals have ear tags so they know where they come from, where they've been, what property they've been on, And so I know that you've been looking at more markets online markets, which is great because I think Though it's good to have a lot of markets in a single area like the ICE, but I think there's still a lot of room for competition there, and also a lot of room for other products that maybe they're ignoring, for people to start up new product markets, and including something as out there as live animal markets, instead of taking them to auction, or so that is where I see the next financial services revolution is more online stuff is happening, because it can, and it's easy, and you can connect different markets. And for a long time you had the commodity markets, which I did a lot of work on in the late 90s, and they are established in obviously Chicago is the home of the commodity market. There's a couple of commodities in New York trading. And meanwhile, London and Paris both have commodity markets, but the volumes are pretty awful. And a lot of that is because the people in the UK and the farmers in the UK and the users of products in the UK and in France don't really use them. And I think there's going to be a point where people are becoming used to using social media, using shared documents, going onto eBay or whatever, and they may be more inclined in the future to look at those markets and go, oh, well, actually, I could sell my wheat forward. I don't have to wait for 6 months and see what happens. I could guarantee that price now, and that's what I hope happens in a lot of those markets, as people start to use things that have been in the US for years, but no one used it because it was too hard, or no one in the UK used it. People in America obviously did. And obviously you've been looking at some of the new markets that are opening up around the world, because with South Africa, South American countries, they're all places that people want to invest and have things to sell. So the world is getting bigger financially, and I think that's going to be reflected in everything that's happening.
The world is getting bigger financially. What a brilliant phrase to end on. I think it's really fascinating. You talk about all of the issues that are wrapped up in, say, Young's Pyramid of Markets. If you don't understand that, get a copy of my book, Victory or Death. You can get it from Ingram Publishing, distributed worldwide, DV Publishing. It's been a really, really interesting show here, talking about after Brexit, we're next for world trade, with Catherine McBride. Thank you so much for being our guest today. Carpe diem. Interesting to note those statistics on the City of London. 7,000 jobs may have been lost because of Brexit, but at the same point in time, there were more than 11,000 people just working on implementing MiFID II. So go figure. Thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in asking questions today. It was a joy to have so much market participation. Sorry that we didn't manage to get a further discussion on the issue of building and inventing pasta, which I'm sorry to say, Chris Messina, I realize your Italian ancestry refuses to allow you to see the objective truth, but actually there were some things that did come from China a long time ago, not just gunpowder. And at the same point in time, I want to thank all of those who've contributed today. Thank you, Lee Calvert. Thank you, Simon Huckle, Marcus Ward, Peter Second, Craig Richardson, Jeff Cutler. Thank you for that great question. Thank you, Peter Second, for your questions too. Really appreciated the questions from Chris Messina, and indeed Women on It, who'll be back here live tomorrow on the interweb, ladies and gentlemen. Next week, guest Hamish Adurian from Sonara, bringing trading solutions to life, back to the whole core question of fintech. My name is Patrick L. Young. Thank you so much for this fantastic show. Catherine McBride will be back, same time, same place next week. Will we still be in the Caribbean? Well, I'll leave you to think about that during the course of the week. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a great week in life, blockchain and markets. My name is Patrick L. Young. This has been IPO-VID Livestream episode 60.